So thank you very much, George. What I want to talk about today is the challenges to communicating science to the public regarding the COVID-19 vaccines. We were doing great. We were vaccinating 3.5 million doses out there a day. We were on our way to 80 to 85% immunization rates in this country for this vaccine, which could have significantly slowed the spread of this virus. And then we hit a wall. And now just a little more than 50% of the American public has been vaccinated, and we've tried everything. We've tried education. We've tried decreasing misinformation. We've tried incentives like free beer or, winning lotteries. We've certainly solved the access issue. It's a free vaccine. It's just 2 shots. We're not asking people to get a heart transplant. And nonetheless, we just have hit a wall. And I think really the discussion over the next 6 months is largely going to be about mandates. But prior to that, what I thought we would do is sort of go through some of the myths and misinformation that surrounds this vaccine. So I divide sort of people who are hesitant about getting this vaccine into 2 groups. The first I would call the vaccine skeptic. I think it's reasonable to be skeptical about vaccines. I think you should be skeptical about anything that you put into your body. When I was asked whether or not I was going to get a COVID-19 vaccine last October, my attitude was, not until I see the data. I mean, I'm actually on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee. We saw those data that we reviewed for Pfizer on December 10th and then Moderna on December 17th. And those were massive submissions. So you got to look at hundreds of pages of data. And then and only then was I convinced that I would definitely get these vaccines. And that's what you saw here. If you look sort of at people who would definitely get a vaccine back in September of 2020, before there was a vaccine, 34% said yes. Then by December, when more of the data was starting to get out there, it was up to 40%. And then most recently, in the study at the University of Washington, showed that this was up to about 70%. So I think most people, when they see the data that are presented in a compelling and passionate and compassionate way, will choose to get this vaccine, at least the people who I would define as skeptics. Then there's the other group, a group that I would define as a cynic. These are folks who don't believe what the government has to say. They don't believe what the medical establishment has to say or what pharmaceutical companies have to say. Reason and logic is not going to convince them, and so don't try. And that's why I think that when it comes right down to it, we may be getting to mandates. Or as Neil deGrasse Tyson says, you can't use logic and reason to convince someone out of an argument that they didn't use logic and reason to get into. Okay, so let's talk about first the real SARS-CoV-2 vaccine safety issues, because there is not a vaccine that we have used on this planet that doesn't have a serious adverse event. And typically they're incredibly rare. But I think any product that has a positive effect will have a negative effect, and some of those negative effects can be quite serious. So let's talk about the real ones. So the mRNA vaccines are a rare cause of myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart muscle. It occurs primarily in older adolescents and young men between 12 and 39 years of age. It occurs primarily after the second dose, usually within a couple days of the second dose. The frequency, depending on exactly what age you look at, is between 1 in 20,000 and 1 in 50,000 vaccine recipients. The good news is that it is a short-lived, self-resolving phenomenon, at least to date, without any evidence of permanent sequelae. But, to use the term mild myocarditis sounds like a contradiction in terms. The term myocarditis suggests something serious. And so this is certainly something that we're dealing with. But you have to put the myocarditis story into context. So I want to sort of spend a couple minutes doing that. First, realize that SARS-CoV-2 virus also causes myocarditis. And if you believe that over the next few years, as John Udell, who is the head of virus research at NIH, has said and wrote an article in PLOS, said that over the next few years, you're going to have 2 choices, which is getting a vaccine or being naturally infected. And so realize that SARS-CoV-2 also causes myocarditis. This was a study that was done with athletes from the Big Ten conference, looking at everyone who had COVID-19 and then doing gadolinium enhanced or cardiac MRIs on everyone to see what the incidence of myocarditis was in people who had COVID-19. So the cardiac testing was performed on 1,597 athletes between March 1st and December 15th of 2020. 37 athletes, or 2.3%, which included 27 men and 10 women were diagnosed with myocarditis by cardiac magnetic resonance imaging. 9 had clinical and 28 had subclinical myocarditis. So the chance of developing myocarditis in healthy young people with COVID-19 was about 1 in 43, which is significantly greater than the 1 in 20,000 to 1 in 50,000 that's observed after receiving an mRNA vaccine. Similarly, MIS-C, which is this multi-system inflammatory syndrome of children, also causes myocarditis. I'd like to say also there is a multi-system inflammatory disease of adults as well. It's severely underdiagnosed. But the point that I want to make here, and this was a sort of a review of the signs and symptoms associated with this particular problem, which is seen, at least in children, and about 1 in 1,000 children who are infected with this virus have this syndrome. It primarily occurs between 6 and 14 years of age. The median is about 9 years of age. When I was on service for a week in January, I saw 5 children with this disease, and it's pretty frightening. Usually what happens is children are infected typically asymptomatically. It's usually just picked up serendipitously when the child was exposed to a friend or family member. They're found to be PCR positive, typically asymptomatic. Then a month later, they come back with high fever and evidence of lung, liver, kidney, and heart involvement. And they're quite sick. They aren't shedding virus anymore. They're PCR negative. They're antibody positive. This is frankly the heinous nature of this disease. I think when this virus came out of China and it was billed as a winter respiratory disease like influenza that can cause severe and occasionally fatal pneumonia, this virus is far more than that. What this virus can do is it causes you to make an immune response to the lining of your blood vessels, essentially against endothelial cells that line your blood vessels, which can cause inflammation of blood vessels, otherwise known as vasculitis. And therefore, because every organ system in your body has blood supply, every organ system is affected. And as you see here in children that have this multi-system inflammatory disease, at least in this one review, 75% had myocarditis. So the point is there really is no avoiding myocarditis. I mean, if you choose not to get a vaccine because you're afraid of that 1 in 20,000 risk of myocarditis, realize that a choice to risk natural infection or a choice to get this multi-system inflammatory disease is a choice to take a greater risk of having myocarditis. Okay, the other sort of serious and real side effect of these vaccines is that the so-called vectored virus vaccines, like the Johnson & Johnson vaccine or the AstraZeneca vaccine, can cause something called thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome. Thrombosis just means blood clot. Thrombocytopenia means a lowered platelet count. And so there's sort of a contradiction in terms in this particular diagnosis, because usually when you have a low platelet count, your problem is bleeding, not clotting. But that's sort of the unusual nature of this. And frankly, if you see somebody with clotting and they have thrombocytopenia, it's usually it's either induced by this virus or induced by heparin. So this is also a rare but real event. It occurs, the original observations was it occurred in about 1 in 500,000 recipients, roughly, suffered this severe event. This, as distinct from sort of younger boys, this case is usually women, primarily younger women who had this problem. And it was seen both with the J&J vaccine and with the AstraZeneca vaccine. Again, you need to put this clotting problem in context. So it's true that if you look at this case where you have in this, you see it's like 1.9 cases per million people, so roughly sort of 2 per million, which is 1 per 500,000. That is greater than the background rate of severe thrombosis, and the CVST just stands for cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, which is to say a blood clot in your brain. So it is greater than the background rate of what you normally have or can see with this kind of problem. But if you look at the second bullet point here, and this is a slide that was put out by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, that there's an estimated risk of 5 to 6 cases of this severe blood clot in the brain per million associated with SARS-CoV-2 infection. So again, it's a greater risk of having severe blood clots associated with the disease than with the vaccine. And so if you believe that, then what that means is the vaccine actually prevents severe blood clots because you're at greater risk of severe blood clots with the disease than you are with the vaccine. Also realize that that blood clots associated with this virus, as you see on the right-hand side, is pretty common. I mean, what we were talking about with thrombosis and thrombocytopenia syndrome is severe blood clots, but clotting is common. I mean, if you talk to cardiovascular surgeons these days, they spend most of their time dealing with venous and arterial blood clots associated with this infection. And then also, if you put it in general context of the use of birth control pills, which instead of being, say, a couple cases per million is rather 500 to 1,200 cases per million for birth control pills, or that's more almost 1,800 cases per million with smokers. These are also known risks of clotting, serious clotting. Okay, the third of the serious events that is associated with these vectored viruses is something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a neurological problem. It's this kind of ascending paralysis, starts in the legs, works its way up. It can be severe and occasionally fatal, although generally Guillain-Barré syndrome is a self-limited illness that goes away without sequelae. And here the incidence was about 1 per 128,000 vaccinees. So again, extremely rare. And people in a reasonable world, a world in which we don't actually live, but in a reasonable world, people would look at this and say, good, there are systems in place that are picking up not only severe side effects, but extraordinarily rare severe side effects. So I can feel confident that there's this vaccine doesn't cause any side effects that are more common. But again, putting this Guillain-Barré syndrome post-vectored viral vaccines in context, the Guillain-Barré syndrome is also a consequence of SARS-CoV-2 infections, as is shown in this particular paper. Oops, sorry, as well as this one. So as a general rule, with the exception of a severe allergic reaction caused by one of the components in the vaccine, as a general rule, vaccines don't do bad things that the natural virus doesn't also do. So for example, the oral polio vaccine, the Albert Sabin's vaccine, which was used in this country from the early 1960s up until about the year 2000, caused polio. It was rare. It happened roughly 1 per 2.4 million doses, but it was real. And we had eliminated polio in this country by the late 1970s. So for the 1980s and 1990s, the 20 years in which we used this vaccine only, the only cases of polio in the United States were caused by the polio vaccine. It's about 8 to 10 children suffered that every year. That's why we moved away from the oral polio vaccine to the inactivated vaccine in the year 2000. Similarly, measles vaccine is a rare cause of thrombocytopenia, again, lowering the platelet count. It occurs in roughly 1 per 30,000 doses, but it's actually common associated with measles infection. Influenza influenza vaccine is a rare cause of Guillain-Barré syndrome. Once every few years, it's found to cause it at roughly 1 per million doses. But recognize that influenza itself is also a cause of Guillain-Barré syndrome at roughly 17 per million people who are infected. So again, you're much more likely to get Guillain-Barré syndrome if you're infected with influenza than if you're given the influenza vaccine. So again, you could argue that since influenza is common, that the influenza vaccine is a way to prevent Guillain-Barré syndrome. And then lastly, the rotavirus vaccine, which I was able to work on with collaborators at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, is itself a rare cause of intussusception. Intussusception just means intestinal blockage. It's rare. It's about 1 per 66,000 doses. Rotavirus disease also does this. So when we introduced rotavirus vaccine in this country in 2006, and basically exchanged wild-type virus, natural rotavirus with vaccine virus, you saw the incidence of intussusception go down. So again, rotavirus vaccine, in a sense, decreased the incidence of intussusception. But this is true of all vaccines, and I think you can be reassured that as a general rule, vaccine viruses don't usually do severe bad things that the natural infection doesn't also do, and do it more frequently. Oops. Okay, so let's go through this sort of the safety issues that really are unfounded, of which there are sadly many. Okay, so one is that COVID-19 vaccines aren't necessary for children. This has actually gotten a lot of play, including on places like WebMD, MedPage, where people have opined that we don't need to give a vaccine to children. Currently children over 12 years of age are recommended to receive this vaccine, and this vaccine now is approved for that age group. The vaccines are now being considered for the next age group, which is the the 5 to 12-year-old. Those data are probably going to be reviewed by the FDA sometime early, either late fall or early winter, maybe after that. I hope we can get a vaccine for children before we hit the late fall, early winter, because you have a confluence of three events, an unfortunate confluence of three events. One, you have a Delta variant that is remarkably contagious. I can't emphasize this enough. The first virus that came out of China, which is the first variant, the so-called D614G variant, that's the one that swept across Asia, swept across Europe, swept across the United States, killed about 500,000 people. That was replaced by the Alpha variant. The reason it was replaced is when you're infected with the Alpha variant, you shed about 10 times more virus from your nose and throat than you did with the D614G variant. The Delta variant, you shed roughly 1,000 times more virus from your nose and throat than you did with that D614G variant, or 100 times more than the Alpha variant. So that's why this virus is so good at selecting out the vulnerable population, and children are a vulnerable population. So hopefully we'll have a vaccine before winter starts, because it is basically a winter virus. Between the winter virus, Delta, and an unvaccinated group of children who are going to go back to school, probably in a situation that's more dangerous than it was the previous winter, in that last winter, I think we were very good about masking and social distancing in schools. I don't think we're going to be as good this year. But in any case, at least as of July 24th, children account for about 21% of cases. There are at least 4 million cases that have been reported. Then those are just children who've been tested and found to be positive. I think you can assume that the number is much greater than that. There's an estimated 40,000 hospitalizations, about 400 deaths. It could be as many as 500. And this really compares similarly to viruses for which we also have vaccines. I mean, influenza causes about 75 to 150 deaths in children a year. This is more than that. Varicella causes between 75 to 100 deaths per year in children and adults. This is more than that. And then measles causes about 500 deaths primarily in children every year, so very similar to that. And we have vaccines for all these diseases. So anything that can cause children to suffer, can cause them to be hospitalized, can cause them to die. If you can prevent that safely, then prevent it. Because if you deal with these people tend to be to think of their children as invulnerable, especially older adolescents. And if you ever deal with these parent activist groups, I'm talking about groups like Families Fighting Flu, Meningitis Angels, National Meningitis Association, all these parents tell the same story. When their children are permanently harmed or killed by these viruses, they all say the same thing. I can't believe this happened to me. And when it happens to them, they become vigorous activists to educate about the disease, to educate about the vaccine, but you don't want to become a member of a parent activist group. And this is a study that was published in June by the CDC, looking at adolescents 12 to 17 years of age who had been hospitalized. What they found in these 200 adolescents is that nearly a third of them required intensive care unit admission. 5% were mechanically ventilated. Many of these children were perfectly normal, had no other health problems prior to this. So this virus can cause severe and occasionally fatal illness. Also, the one that worries me the most, actually, is this multi-system inflammatory disease. Actually, the most recent number as of today, which is July 28th, is 4,200 cases of MIS-C, and I think that's really probably underdiagnosed. The other thing is that there is a subset of these children who then go on to develop a longer-term symptom, so-called long haulers, where they have sort of some mental deficits, as well as fatigue, headache, muscle pain, joint ache, etc. That's the heinous nature of this virus. It causes vasculitis, and vasculitis can leave one with longer-term problems. And there's the isolation that's been associated with this virus. I think no one suffered this more than the children. Certainly, the incidence of teen suicide has dramatically increased. Domestic violence, child abuse. So I think there's many psychological reasons for why we need to vaccinate children. The other of the many sort of inaccurate fears that people have about vaccines, this is another one, that vaccines can decrease fertility. I mean, this is probably one of the more common questions I get asked. Women of childbearing age say they don't want to take the risk that they will decrease fertility. But I actually wrote an op-ed about this that was published in The Hill a while ago. The notion of this was born when two researchers petitioned the European Medicines Agency, which is kind of like the European equivalent of the FDA, to withdraw the approval for COVID-19 vaccines, claiming that the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, which is the protein that is to which you induce an immune response with these mRNA vaccines or with these vectored virus vaccines, that this protein shares genetic sequences with a protein called syncytin-1, which is a protein that's on placental cells, the surface of placental cells. It's important for placental health. So the thinking then is that while you're making an immune response to the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, you're also inadvertently making an immune response to syncytin-1, and therefore inadvertently making an immune response against your own placenta, which then presumably would make you less likely to carry a child to term. Well, first of all, that's not true. These two proteins don't share really genetic sequences. I mean, it's like saying you and I have the same social security number because they both contain the number 5. That's just not true. And so an immune response directed against a spike protein isn't an immune response against syncytin-1. Also, there were in the phase 3 trials of the placebo of the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, there were about 36 women who became pregnant during those phase 3 trials. Remember, those were placebo-controlled trials. If it was true that this vaccine decreased fertility, then virtually all of those instances of pregnancy should have been in the placebo group, but they weren't. It was divided 18 in the vaccine group and 18 in the placebo group. So the vaccine appeared to neither enhance nor decrease fertility. Also remember, natural infection, of which there have been at least 100 million cases in our country over the last year, also induces antibodies against SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. So if that's true, then what should have happened last year is that the incidence of birth should have decreased. That didn't happen. The incidence of births this past year was really the same as in the previous year. So all the evidence supports the notion that COVID-19 vaccines don't in any sense impact fertility. Okay, the other one is that COVID-19 vaccines alter DNA. I think, we've entered a new era in vaccines. I mean, previously, if you wanted to make an immune response against the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, you would give a weakened form of the virus, as we do for the measles or mumps or German measles or chickenpox vaccine or one of the rotavirus vaccines, or you would give a whole killed version of the virus, which people are pursuing actually in China. That is their vaccine strategy, as we do here for the hepatitis A vaccine or the rabies vaccine. Or you give just the protein itself, just you give that purified protein, and then you make an immune response to the protein. That's what we do for the hepatitis B vaccine. That's what we do for the human papillomavirus vaccine. But now we're doing something different. We're giving the gene that codes for the protein. So your body makes the protein, the viral protein, and then your body makes antibodies to the viral protein. So we've entered a new era of vaccines, this genetic era, if you will. And I think the minute people hear the term genetic vaccine, they think this is going to alter my DNA. So can that happen? We'll start with the mRNA vaccines. So mRNA is just a small piece of genetic material that codes for the protein. In this case, the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. It's in a sort of lipid nanoparticle. It enters the cytoplasm of your cell, where it then enters the ribosomal system, is translated to a protein, which is then actually cut up into these small sort of 10 to 15 mer amino acid sized peptides and put on the surface of the cell, primarily dendritic cells, which are antigen presenting cells. And that's the way that works. Now, in order for it to alter your DNA, first, it has to get into the nucleus. The only way that mRNA can get into the nucleus is if it has a nuclear access signal, which it doesn't have. So it actually can't get into the nucleus. Even if it got into the nucleus, it's mRNA, it's not DNA, so it's not going to alter your DNA. It would first have to be transcribed back to DNA, which requires an enzyme called reverse transcriptase, which it also doesn't have. If it got into the nucleus, which it can't, or it was reverse transcribed into DNA, which it can't be because it doesn't have that enzyme, it would still have to be integrated into DNA, which requires an enzyme called integrase, which it also doesn't have. So the chances that messenger RNA can alter your DNA is not small, it's zero. So I think one should realize that. Although I never quite understand why it is that people think that when they alter your DNA, it's always for the worse. I mean, why can't you develop, like X-ray vision? Okay, so then you have the replication defective viruses. This is the way that works in the case of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It's a human adenovirus type 26, which is an uncommon serotype of this particular virus. It is genetically engineered so it can't reproduce itself. When it's injected into your body, it does enter the nucleus, but it can't. It is a non-integrating virus. I mean, think about how common adenoviruses are. It's a common cold virus. I mean, if this virus altered your DNA, it would be the best news for gene therapy yet. It doesn't because it can't because it's not. It's again a non-integrating type of virus. So it's not like retroviruses or lentiviruses. I mean, those specifically can alter your DNA, but this is not. These are not viruses that can do this. But again, I think the chances that these would change your DNA is about the same as you're becoming Spider-Man. So I don't think you're going to become Spider-Man either. Although, because, you never want to leave the science because, we're true to the science here in these skeptic societies. You become Spider-Man when you're bitten by a radioactive spider. Okay, next is that COVID-19 vaccine shouldn't be given during pregnancy. Initially, when this vaccine was launched, these mRNA vaccines were launched in December, and then the Johnson & Johnson vaccine in February. There were the studies that were done, the phase 3 studies, the 30,000 person study of Moderna, the 44,000 person study of Pfizer, the roughly 40,000 person study of Johnson & Johnson didn't include pregnant women. And when that's true, the FDA or the CDC pretty much says the same thing when studies don't include pregnant women. They say it's contraindicated in pregnant women. But we know that the pregnant women are 3 times more likely to require intensive care unit if they're infected with this virus as compared to women of the same age who aren't pregnant. 2 to 3 times more likely to require intubation, mechanical ventilation, or ECMO support, which is like a heart-lung machine, and 1.5-fold increased risk of death. So what the CDC did, surprisingly, because they've never done this before for any other vaccine, they said that a pregnant woman could reasonably choose to get this vaccine, even though we didn't have any data at the time showing that this vaccine was safe or effective in that group. Now, soon we did, because there was a system that was put in place, something called the V-Safe system, where women who were pregnant that did get this vaccine were immediately put into the system, so you could see whether or not the vaccine in any way negatively affected the pregnant woman or in any way negatively affected their unborn child, and eventually hundreds of children were born. And what they found was that there was no difference really in terms of pregnancy outcome, pregnancy complications, or neonatal outcome or neonatal complications. So those women who did choose initially to get the vaccine made the right choice. And when these data became available, the CDC then said that this vaccine or these vaccines are recommended for pregnant women. The other question that people have is that the vaccine shouldn't be given during lactation or breastfeeding. But again, there are data that have looked at this, and what this particular study showed was that researchers examined 30 pregnant, 16 lactating, and 57 women who were neither pregnant nor lactating who'd received mRNA vaccines. They found that after the second dose, fever was reported in 4 pregnant women, or 14%, 7 lactating women, 44%, and 27 not lactating pregnant women, 52%, so pretty much the same safety profile, and that binding and neutralizing antibodies directed against SARS-CoV-2 virus, and then T-cell responses were observed in all 3 groups. Binding and neutralizing antibodies were observed in infant cord blood and breast milk. So the woman not only was protecting herself, but she was protecting her unborn child. Okay, the other, and now we move into sort of the truly crazy issues, is that COVID-19 vaccines cause people to be magnetic. So here is Sherry Tenpenny. She is one of these sort of, I don't know if you saw that New York Times report recently looking at what they called the Dirty Dozen, which are those 12 people who have been able to successfully put out more misinformation about vaccines than any other. She's one of them. Here she is testifying in front of Ohio lawmakers, claiming that COVID-19 vaccines make people magnetic. Honestly, I think these anti-vaccine activists sit in back rooms and make bets on what they can get people to believe. I can just see her sitting back there saying, I bet I can get them to believe that they become magnetic. No, you can't do it. And then they make bets to see what they can get people to believe, because that's the only thing that explains this, as far as I'm concerned. But, as you would imagine, they were successful. Here is a woman testifying at the same hearing, showing that, in fact, this key is sticking to her chest, proving that she now has become magnetic, and she has the facial expression that everybody has when they become magnetic, which is stress. Okay, so mRNA vaccines contain lipids, potassium chloride, monobasic potassium phosphate, sodium chloride, dibasic sodium phosphate, dihydrate, and sucrose, none of which are paramagnetic. Professor Michael Coey from the School of Physics at Trinity College of Dublin has stated, quote, "You would need about 1 gram of iron metal to attract and support a permanent magnet at the injection site, something you would easily feel if it was there." And then my favorite, Joe Schwartz, who, as I'm sure most of you know, is a wonderful chemist who explains science simply and well. He has many books out there doing just that. He's from the Office of Science and Society at McGill University, has stated, quote, "Our liver, which is loaded with iron, isn't ripped out of our body when we get an MRI scan, is it?" MRI stands for magnetic resonance imaging. And people who get iron injections or take iron supplements, which do contain ferrous or ferric ions that are paramagnetic, do not become magnetized. But here's Joe Schwartz showing the same thing that woman had showed, which is apparently this spoon is sticking to him. Okay, the other thing and this has gotten a lot of play actually on the internet, on various YouTube videos, is the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, which you're making when you get the mRNA vaccines or these vector virus vaccines, is in fact a toxin. This is one of several people who've been out there sort of putting this notion out there on YouTube videos. And it's really based on this one awful paper that was published in Circulation Research. So what these researchers did is it was a study of mice that were inoculated by an abnormal route intratracheally, into the windpipe, with an extraordinarily high quantity, roughly 500 million plaque-forming units of a pseudovirus called vesicular stomatitis virus, which obviously is not part of any of these vaccines, that was expressing the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. I mean, normally when you work with mice, and I certainly worked with millions of mice, I feel like, during our work on the rotavirus vaccine, you try and mimic events in humans as closely as you can. And even when you do that, the animals are only so predictive of man, as we say in the vaccine world. Mice lie and monkeys exaggerate, and I think that's certainly true here, where there's no attempt to, in any sense, mimic events that occur in humans. It's the wrong route. It's not the same virus. It's not the same quantity of virus. So I think you learn nothing from a paper like this, and I do not understand why these kinds of studies ever get published. Although I have learned that you can publish anything. I mean, prior to COVID-19, there were about 4,000 medical and scientific papers published every day in the scientific or medical literature, and they follow a bell-shaped curve. I mean, some papers are excellent, some are awful, most are more or less mediocre, but I think you can get anything published. The Misinformation potpourri comes with this particular movie that came out in May of 2020, and within a week actually had 8 million viewers. If you've ever seen this movie, it makes a number of statements. One, that hydroxychloroquine cures COVID-19, which it does not. It doesn't actually either prevent or treat the virus. That SARS-CoV-2 was manipulated to create a pandemic strain. This has gotten actually a lot of play recently. There's a podcast called This Week in Virology. It's Vince Racconello from Columbia, who's a virologist. And over the past month and a half or so, he has had a number of virologists on that show dissecting this current virus and explaining why, given its genetic makeup, it's virtually impossible that this was anything other than a product of nature. So I do think that I don't think we figured out exactly what either the original host or although there's clearly bat sequences of bat coronavirus in this virus, I think we haven't figured out what that intermediate host might have been. I really do wish that China would be a little more open at letting researchers from the world go into their wet markets, especially where there are a lot of mammals all close together, many of which really frankly were illegally sold, and let people try and figure out what exactly happened, because this is now the third pandemic potential virus in the past 10 years, right? SARS-1 was 2002, MERS was 2012, and now you have this. Actually, it's the past 20 years. So I think you can assume that there is going to be another pandemic potential virus out there, and you'd like to figure out how to prevent that if you can. The other is that the influenza vaccine increases the chance of getting COVID-19. Also nonsense that the influenza vaccine contains SARS-CoV-2, which obviously it doesn't, that microbes in the ocean can cure COVID-19, that wearing a protective mask activates SARS-CoV-2. Actually, Louis Gohmert, who was a congressman from Texas, actually went on national TV and said that he thought that he caught SARS-CoV-2 by wearing a mask. That Bill Gates created SARS-CoV-2 pandemic so that he could make money selling vaccines to prevent it, because obviously $60 billion is not enough for him, and that COVID-19 death statistics have been manipulated to control the public. It's just all very upsetting that these kind of conspiracy theories get play among the American population, but they certainly do. Oops. And so that's it. That is all I have, and I want to thank you for your attention.